One.
Hi, I'm Adam Ciuca, and this is my AP research presentation on the effects of background music. For the contents of this presentation, I will go over the scholarly conversation surrounding the effects of background music, go over my gap that I found, discuss my methodology, discuss my results, and ultimately conclude with my new understanding. Some important terms to know for this presentation is, for my study specifically, a musician is someone who has practiced or studied a musical instrument for at least 5 years consecutively. A non-musician is someone who hasn't studied or practiced a musical instrument for at least 5 years consecutively. Background music, or what will be referred to sometimes as BGM, is music designed to be an accompaniment to some sort of task or event. So music in a grocery store, music in a car, music while you're working out. A cognitive task is a task that requires you to process new information and use that new information later on. And a motor task is something that requires physical means to complete a task. The overall literature review goes over the effects of background music in what I found 3 ways: discusses how background music impacts cognitive task performance, motor task performance, and how the effects of preferred and familiar background music can impact mood and performance of cognitive tasks and motor tasks. Important sources for my research: Ciuca and other colleagues conducted a very recent systematic literature review that went over all topics and subsets of the effects of background music. It provided a great basis and starting point for my research and allowed me to kind of hone in on what my eventual topic would be. Lee and others conducted a study on how lyrics in background music can affect cognitive task performance, and they, as well as many other studies, have found that lyrics are extremely detrimental towards focus and attention, and overall cause cognitive task performance to decrease. It's the most discussed topic in scholarly conversation and has been found to be the most detrimental aspect of background music overall. Kiss and Lionel conducted a study on how background music can impact mood and arousal and motivation to complete both cognitive tasks and motor tasks. Familiar and preferred background music has been found to increase motivation as compared to unfamiliar music, but can also be prone to distract you. Velasco and Harumi conducted a literature review aiming to see how background music can be beneficial, and they found that overall, between genre lyrics and volume, calmer, non-lyrical, and quieter music can impact beneficial cognitive performance. It can help with focus and decrease mind wandering. The scholarly gap I came across was that there is a lack of scholarly conversation and studies on the effects of background music on musicians as compared to non-musicians. There's a lack of research on whether or not background music is more beneficial to musicians or non-musicians, and what music genres and types are either more beneficial or detrimental, and what impacts they have on musicians as compared to non-musicians. Patson and Tippett found that background music is more detrimental towards musicians completing a cognitive task than non-musicians, whereas Hanning, conducting a study building on Patson and Tippett, found the complete opposite, that background music is beneficial towards musicians compared to non-musicians. So they create a very wide gap of 2 conflicting ideas, so I wanted to see if I could fill that gap. Which brings me to my research question and goal, which is, what are the effects of background music on musicians compared to non-musicians? I hypothesize that musicians will be more affected by background music than non-musicians. They'll be more prone to being distracted by the background music due to their practice in musical instruments. They'll be more likely to be focused on the musical aspects of the songs as compared to non-musicians. And there will be more variance in their scores across treatments and different musical types. My overall method was an experimental design with 19 participants gathered from a survey. This survey not only gained consent to partake in the experiment, but it separated participants into either musicianship or non-musicianship based upon what instruments they've been playing and for how long. My assessment tool was PSAT reading practice passages taken from the Pacific Grove High School PSAT reading site. They have a whole bunch of passages with 8 questions each. I used a random number generator to select 3 passages with 5 questions for each of those passages. So in total, I had 3 passages. My treatment, I had 3 different music types playing while participants would take the 3 different passages, either silence, peaceful piano, or complex rock. I chose peaceful piano and complex rock as my 2 musical types because they differ widely in the style of music, how many instruments there are. The complex rock also has lyrics. So I was really aiming to see how many musical aspects I could get in the complex rock to differentiate from the peaceful piano to study the effects. My procedure, there were 3 different testing days that participants came into. They were randomly assigned in order of passages to read and take the test on for each music type. That way, there would not be the same passage for music type for all 3 of the testing days. They had 10 minutes to complete each passage, and once everyone was completed their first passage, they would hand it in, get the next passage, and the new music type would start. This was repeated until all 3 passages were complete. And for ethics, informed consent was gained for all participants. All results were anonymous. They were debriefed after the experiment, and they were free to leave at any time. Okay, so this is a graph of my results, the red line being the musicians and the blue line being the non-musicians, from silence to peaceful piano to complex rock. The most important thing to observe is that during the silence treatment, both groups were very similar in their scores. The silence was the only difference that was not statistically significant. The average scores for peaceful piano and complex rock were statistically significant difference for each of the groups, but not silence. Silence provided an excellent control and allowed me to see from silence how the different musical treatments impacted the cognitive performance of my participants. Overall, the results show that musicians varied a lot more based upon what type of music was being played than non-musicians did. And one possible explanation for this can be the attention drainage effect, which was highlighted by Say and Shu, which states that incoming stimuli takes
Just pause the timer.
Thank you.
I was advancing it, isn't it? Okay, that's no problem to you.
Awesome. Okay. The attention drainage effect states that incoming stimuli takes away our attention from whatever else we're trying to focus on, even subconsciously. So that can explain why, especially for the musicians, the rock music caused their extremely low score, because more musical aspects such as more instruments, faster tempo, and lyrics, especially as discussed earlier, took away their attention even subconsciously from the reading passage that they were trying to take. However, the non-musicians, as being not musically trained as the musicians had been, could have been less likely to be prone to focusing on the rock music. And instead, as mentioned, their mood and motivation to complete reading passage could have been impacted by the faster tempo and more electric, energizing state of the rock music. Piano was the most interesting treatment because the musicians did extremely well when piano was playing, and the non-musicians did the worst when piano was playing. I wanted to investigate why that was, and my main theory for why the non-musicians did poorly was that there was a loss of motivation, a loss of arousal to complete the reading passage because the peaceful piano was less energizing, only had one instrument. It was meant to be mellow and peaceful. However, for the musicians, as they have been trained in musical instruments, it could have been more familiar to them, which, as mentioned previously, familiar music has been shown to decrease mind wandering, increase focus. So piano being more familiar to the musicians could have helped them focus in on their reading passage, which explained why they did extremely well when piano was playing. Overall, my new understanding is that musicians are much heavily impacted by the type of background music as compared to non-musicians. Their scores varied much more based upon what music was being played as compared to non-musicians. and they were more prone to distraction with the complex rock as the non-musicians were. This is especially important for musicians and non-musicians who are trying to complete cognitive tasks such as studying or reading or working on a project, because they have to be a lot more careful on what type of music is being played in the background, if any. This can also be important for teachers or other professors who might think of playing music while students are working. It's just important to know what your demographic is and how the music being played might impact them. For further implications, my biggest limitation for this study was that I only had 19 participants. My survey gathered about 100 responses, but I could only bring in 19 participants. So more participants could allow for more valid and unbiased data. So for future studies that include more participants, that could provide more concrete data. In addition, other studies could use different music types. While being played, I only used peaceful piano taken from Spotify and complex rock also taken from Spotify. So other studies could use different music genres, possibly hip hop or jazz, just to name some examples. As well as for music style, studies could examine correlations between musical training, such as are you trained in classical string quartets or rock bands. So investigating how musicians are trained and what music they're more familiar with could impact future data. We're excited.
Yes, sir. How did your initial exploration of the scholarly conversation lead to your final research question?
Yes, so my initial exploration was kind of rough. I was honed in too deep on specifically how musical training previously can impact scores on reading comprehension tests. I knew I wanted to do something with music and psychology, but I honed in too far on how musical training impacts cognitive performance. I ended up going to my teachers and asking, and that helped broaden out my search to study musicianal training as compared to non-musical training on cognitive performance eventually. So.
Mr. George.
How do the limitations of your method or data influence your new understanding?
Yes, so my biggest limitation was that I had a smaller sampling size. So when studying for, say, the statistical significance of the differences in my data, they had to be taken with caution because of my small sampling size. So overall, I just had to be weary of whether or not my results were legitimate and biased. And overall, just remember that for future implications, new studies need to have a larger sampling size.
What was the most important research skill you developed as a result of this process, and how might you apply it to your future endeavors?
The most important research skill I learned was organization. I had to manage a lot of new data from scholarly conversation and then my own data from the experiments. I had a lot of data points to work with, so making sure I stayed organized and looked at the relationships between data points that I found not only in the literature but in my own experiment really was a new skill that I had to work on, and I think I did pretty well in that. I hope to apply that further in other research I do moving forward, so organization and conversation between data was 2 important.